Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack, the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. So every year we get new ministers in this area, and they come in from all over the place, and oftentimes they're new to our area and they need to get they need to get broken into what it means to be part of Broome County. But more importantly, they bring with them some impressive stories about how they came into ministry and where they're serving currently. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a newbie in an area like Broome County. So welcome to Encounter. Thank you. This is Robert and Michele Clark. They're a clergy couple. And you want to tell me a little bit about yourself and what makes Robert tick?
Okay, well, I actually grew up here in upstate New York. I was brought up in New York. I've always been a United Methodist. And in fact, it was there that during a youth leader actually asked me if I would ever thought about going into ministry. And I'd said, no, not really. There's no money into that. Instead, I'm going to be an engineer and go make more money than what my father ever made. And I succeeded in doing that. I've worked in 36 states, 3 countries, traveling around the nation. But God never stopped calling me. And that person did have a discerning nature and realized that I had been called. And we returned back to church, got very active in it. I was involved in, the choir, started teaching Sunday school, became chairman of finance committee, also nominations committee, became a certified lay speaker. But all these different things I was doing were on my terms. They were convenient, used to doing them. But then, unfortunately, I read the Bible again. Or I should say, it read me. And I read that passage where it said, Jesus told us, pick up your cross and follow me. And he wanted all of my life. And part of following him was going into ministry and give it all.
All right.
So,
well, this is a great story. Michele, how about you? What makes you tick?
Well, I think about my story, and it's quite different from Bob's. I was not raised in the church. I was baptized Lutheran. And then as we made our way from New York, I was born and raised in Gloversville. We made our way from New York to the south, to Georgia, and ultimately to North Carolina, where God finally got a hold of me and said, it's time that you return. And it was during that time, the same period where Bob was so active in the church, I too had that thirst. But there were, as with everybody, there were family troubles, and I was kind of in a dark place. And Jesus just reached out his hand and pulled me out of that pit and just put me on the path. And it was a short time later that I realized, yeah, I have to give him my life. And I did. And this is why I'm here today. We came back to New York to be closer to family. My roots were wanting to dig deep again. And it brought us here to Binghamton.
So you both were seminary students at about the same time. That must have been interesting to be students at the same time.
Very much.
I mean, and how long have you been in ministry?
I started as a student pastor in 2007.
Oh, okay.
And that was when we entered seminary as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been 10 years now, and loving every minute of it.
And
so we got our bachelor's degree in modular religion, and it was an adult class where you go once a week, for 4 hours, and within 4 or 5 weeks you'd have a semester worth of class done. And we would drive from where we were, which was close to Duke, all the way down to Mount Olive in Fenton, and we'd learn how to go and study together, and it worked out real nice, but you do that once a week. We knew that God kind of has a sense of humor, because when we got into seminary, where she got appointed as student pastor is back down there by Mount Olive, and now we had to turn around and drive 4 days a week back up to Duke for seminary.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, like he said, we learned how to study while we drove. While he drove, I read,
Yep.
I questioned. So we were able to get through it together in that way.
So what are some of the, what is it like to be a clergy couple?
Sometimes lonely, to be honest, because having churches with different schedules and,
Right.
and different needs and calls upon themselves, right? They're not always the same. So I'll be home one night and he won't be. The last 3 nights I've been in meetings and didn't get home till 9 o'clock at night or after. So, he's there, and I'm not.
Right.
And that works the other way too. So that's what I mean by lonely.
And
We're
you're-
not together.
And you're in a 2-point charge, right?
I am in a
Yeah.
2-point charge.
Now that's got to be an interesting thing for our listeners to hear
Oh,
too.
my.
What does it mean to be a pastor of 2 congregations?
I didn't have any gray hair before I came down. I tease. I love my congregations. I serve Greene, First United Methodist Church of Greene, as well as North Fenton United Methodist Church. And they're both lovely congregations, completely different, but both loving their God. And as with many churches today, they're in the midst of overcoming some things, but they are strong and they know where the future is leading them. And me being brand new brings a whole new perspective for them too, which I think adds a layer of excitement for them. At least that's what I'm told.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So First United Methodist in Chenango Bridge is your appointment. So
Yes.
What do you think of that congregation?
I tell you, it's interesting getting used to being back up here in the Northeast, because summers are so short. So a lot of folks are gone every other weekend, and so you keep being introduced to new as they return. So that has been a real joy. And the other thing that's been very interesting is this church too. They had overcome some difficulties, but one of the things they did is they've created a new organizational structure to make things a lot more streamlined. Whereas before, if someone got on fire for a ministry or a mission that they wanted to do, by the time it made it through that committee and then made it to the board to say okay to it, sometimes their fire had gone out.
Right.
And so you did the death by committee type thing.
Exactly.
Whereas now you have a governance, which was the church council, and then the individual groups are really responsible for the areas of making disciples. And so it's a lot more streamlined. I get to just equip the people. They bring an idea, we equip them, saying, go for it. If God's laying on your heart, why wait for a committee to say whether you should do it or not?
So for our non-Methodist viewers, the typical time for a new minister to enter into their new call is July, right? So
Yes.
it's July.
Yes. July 1st.
Yeah.
July
So
1st.
we did arrive here the end of June, and then of course July 2nd was our first time in the pulpit at the new churches. So.
Well, and that must have been interesting, because your last week at your old church would have been the week before, right?
we actually ended up with 1 week break because
1 week break? Okay.
they knew from our distance that we were having to travel.
Right.
It wasn't kind of like across the street ones like we've done before.
Right. So this was a big move for you all.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, very good.
Yes, it
So
was.
has that move been good for you? Or?
Yes. Oh my gosh. For one thing, like I said, the congregations are awesome, and you can tell that God's got a purpose for why Bob and I have been brought to these congregations. Yeah. Our gifts, like for myself, of compassion and empathy, healing, and just loving people back into into loving Christ and letting Christ love them. This is what I have bring to them, and I think they're in a place where they need that right now. Plus, we're closer to family. My roots are starting to spread out. Our oldest is in Rochester, our son, and our middle daughter is in Gloversville, each with their own families, and so we're like 2.5 hours from each one, where for the past 20 years it was 12 hours.
Yeah, yeah.
12-hour
right?
drive, yeah.
So it's like, and then when you look at the beauty of the mountains, when we come from down east of Raleigh in North Carolina, close
that's
to
a
the shore, and
flat
it's
country.
flat,
Yeah.
it's sandy, it's
we
million gnats.
We were 108 feet above sea level.
Oh,
So-
right. Yeah. Yeah, I've always North Carolina is an example of contrast.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
So it's, the eastern part is very flat, western part is incredibly mountainous.
Yes,
So
it is.
you end up having those two extremes within 100 miles of each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Be in the mountains one day and then be on the beach the next. So yeah, it's very different from New York, that's for sure. But
Very much so.
what you had said something about your gifts for ministry. What do you consider to be some of your gifts, Robert?
Well, mine is definitely the caring ministry. In the past, when I was in North Carolina, used to volunteer as an associate chaplain at the hospital, and really loved doing that. Do a lot with the aged, but also mine is leadership. Especially going through the corporate world. I had been acting director of operations, so I can bring the leadership structure and that style to it, as well as I'm a very good encourager and equipper. So, and that's really where that church is now, with going to the new structure, but then allowing them to be equipped to start becoming more outward focused than inward focused.
And what would you consider to be some of the needs of the congregation that you're currently in that kind of speaks to?
So what I think the congregation needs a little more chance and opportunities for relationship building, both internally as well as externally.
So the people in the church don't quite know each other?
Yeah,
enough?
there's a bit of that. The church is large enough that you have individual groups, small groups that get to know each other real well and in depth, but there's not as much from a larger congregation being able to come together. And then also just basically getting to relearn and know the community.
Yeah. And Michele, it must be particularly hard for you because you have two cultures
Yes.
that you're dealing with
Very
in
unique cultures.
in two very, very different churches. So what's it like, how do you process that?
That's a difficult question to answer because I'm not sure how I process it yet. It's only been, less than 2 months
2
that
months.
I've been here. I have recognized the unique DNA of each congregation, and I've tried to assimilate myself and be trying to understand each one. North Fenton is a little bit more aged congregation, and it's out there in
Middle
in the
nowhere.
Middle of
country.
God's country,
Yeah.
right?
In the middle of God's country, that's correct.
Yeah.
But it is such a loving and caring congregation where they take care of the neighbors, like if someone is sick, even though member or not, you don't have to
Right.
be a member. It's a community thing.
Right.
They're there to take care of them, to look out for them, to take them food, take them to doctor appointments or whatever. They're very communal in that way. Not to say that Greene is not. They are also, but just in a different way. They're a much more active congregation. For example, they have for the past 30-some years, and hopefully that's right, they have put on a community festival called Apple Fest. Every year for 30-some years, they fill the ball flats in Greene with craft vendors, food vendors, live music from all over. They have a kids zone, and they do, this small congregation does this by themselves. And
Wow.
it just amazes me. And they too are not a real young congregation. There's a good mix, but they both have the same need of getting more people involved in their ministries
Right.
to the community and others. So in that way, they're similar. But yeah, so I'm still trying to figure out some things.
Well, and it takes, and this is something that would be interesting for people to know, is that not every congregation is the same.
That's right.
Not every, and it takes a while for a minister, when they come into a congregation, to actually know how that congregation ticks, what makes them get up in the morning, how do they process different things, and how do they do ministry. It takes, may even take in some cases over a year before you actually figure some of that stuff out.
That's right. That's
So
right.
I'll pray for you as you
Thank you. I thank you.
as
As
you
we
make
have
your
one,
ways in your various communities.
appreciate that very much.
So, we've talked a little bit about what your gifts are for ministry. What do you think is one of the hardest things that you've had to deal with in ministry?
I'd say the hardest for mine is, because of my leadership and the past experience in the secular leadership,